Good morning and welcome to my hometown. And thanks, Achille, for insisting that I should be here. And thank you all. And I'm particularly delighted that Miss Angela Davis is visiting this particular site. For she and Steve were representative figures of a particular time in the global imagination of black people, particularly young and very young black people like myself, who were trying to figure out how to make our way out of the darkness of apartheid. So thank you for your life and your contributions, and for sparing our imagination. But those processes of imagination that I'm talking about, which were taking place around here in the 1970s in particular, were preceded by more than 100 years in this little town called King Williamstown by multiple discourses, conversations among some of the early African intellectuals in this country. This place, King Williamstown, which became one of the global centers, became, in effect, one of the global centers of African intellectual thought, comparable to any other in the modern world, comparable to what was going on in London, to what was going on in Paris, to what was going on in New York, to what was going on essentially anywhere in the African diaspora. Paul Gilroy has written, of course, about the Black Atlantic as that global coalition and that politics in which anti-imperialism and anti-racism might be seen to interact, if not fuse. And this part of the world, I would argue, and of course, in Gilroy's work, Africa doesn't feature very much, let alone King Williamstown or Ginsberg. And so my aim with Gilroy, as it is with the entire scholarship around the African diaspora and African intellectual thought, is to insert Ginsberg into that discourse. And I suppose my book about Migo is in part an attempt to do that. But there's a point that Gilroy makes about how, in fact, European modernity and American modernity has, over a long period of time, written out the history of places like this. And yet, it is places like this that have created a unique body of reflections on modernity and its contents or discontents, which is an enduring presence in the cultural and political struggles of their descendants today. These discourses, which were started 100 years ago, 150 years ago, by our great-grandparents, are the discourses that I hope by the end of the paper I shall illustrate inform the very debates that we participate in now in South Africa. So I'm reluctant, very reluctant, to make that temporal distinction between the past, the present, and the future. The present is in the past as much as the past is in the present. This occlusion of these voices from the periphery, if you like, makes possible, Gilroy further argues, to tell the story of modernity without raising awkward questions about the existence or coexistence of good and evil within that modernity. And in many ways, that is the narrative of contemporary South Africa, where we can be in institutions where it's possible that we can exist without raising awkward questions about the coexistence of good and evil in those institutions, where it is often assumed that these questions were settled in 1994. And why, Xolela, should you raise them now again? Things that we thought Mandela, of all people, had settled. How dare you? But in the end, an innocent modernity emerges within these institutions, whether it's Paris or Berlin or London or Cape Town or the University of Cape Town. And these discourses and how they have traveled around the world have also, I mean, one of the mistakes I think Gilroy makes, of course, is that even in his discussion of the relationship between African Americans and Africans in this Black Atlantic, the relationship tends to be, in his conception, one way. It's the African Americans teaching the Africans modernity. But I suppose if Gilroy would dig deep into the history of these places, would find, for example, that the great debates around cultural integration or integration versus cultural nationalism that took place, say, between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, or Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois further back in time, are debates actually that were taking place in this part of the world in the early 19th century, in the 1820s, and in fact, the late 18th century. It remains, of course, for students to go into the archive, not the archive of the non-racial Achille, but the archive of the anti-colonial, to discover what these connections might have been and how these ideas might have traveled. As we speak, we have no empirical evidence of it. But the mere fact that African people or black people were talking about whether to submit and integrate into white civilization and form those non-racial relationships, or whether to stay out of those relationships and keep going on their own, in the way that Biko would argue or Sobukwe would argue. Those were debates that were taking place between two Xhosa chiefs, particularly in this area, called Ncika and Ndlambe in the 1820s, long, long before Du Bois, Booker T. Washington had these conversations. King Williamstown, of course, was not only the center of gravity, if you like, the center of colonial gravity. It was, in many, many ways, a part of South Africa that shaped, for many, many years, many decades, even to this day, how this country would evolve and how it would evolve in its debates around questions of race. And it is into that I wish to go into. It was this little town, named after a British monarch with whom we have absolutely no connection, but to whose name we still hold on for dear life, as we do, of course, with other similarly incongruous names around here, such as Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Hanover, East London, Stutterheim, and of course, King Williamstown. Some years ago, I brought the writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o here, and his memorable description of the Eastern Cape has never left me. A place whose memory lies buried under European memory, the European memory of its names. Indeed, if you go around looking at the public landscape in this town, It is a celebration, literally, of the very queens and monarchs more broadly, as well as the artillery that put black people down for centuries. We were comrades here with when I was an activist with Andile Africa. We were in Azapo together early in the 1980s, and we were raising these issues. But even 1994, those artilleries, those cannons, are they still there in that park? Those cannons that were used to put down African people are still there. The statue of Queen Victoria still graces the center of this town. And there is nothing really in terms of that public architecture that speaks to the rich history of this place. If that is not a symbolic representation of the fecklessness of the ANC government, I don't know what does. I shall return to the disgraceful manner in which the ANC has neglected black cultural patrimony. I was thinking about this word patrimony, Emma, and I was wondering whether I should say matrimony. So, Emma is my student, so you let me know. We'll have a discussion about that. But to understand the seriousness of this neglect by the ANC, and I'm very explicit and categoric about it, one has to understand the place of King Williamstown in the colonial system and the intellectual systems that it passed on to the leaders, the early leaders of the African National Congress. Of course, this place was a buzz of the plurality of voices and disagreement. It was, to borrow from Richard Wright, writing about Chicago, the most incisive of Negro thought took place here in the 1800s. However, when the colonial government, the British colonial government, extended its boundaries to include King Williamstown, it sought once and for all to go beyond the missionary education to actually, literally, physically put any resistance down. And so King Williamstown was not just a site of civilization, of intellectual development in both the black and the white community, but it also became, particularly in the 1840s and the 1850s, a new hub for a military system that was intended to descend like an imprisoning grid upon all the Xhosa, underneath which they would be made over, argues Noel Mostert. From this town, the colonialists and the missionaries put aside the Bible and indeed literally undertook their military incursions into the surrounding villages, taking the cattle and burning the fields of the local people, leading ultimately to the eruption of the so-called cattle killings of 1857. For over 100 years, we have been led to believe, and Achille and I are partly guilty of this. We have been led to believe, and we have argued, that the cattle killings were the actions of a millennial movement that committed national suicide because of irrational religious beliefs, a belief that the dead would one day arise, to cite one of the authoritative books on that episode. That here you had this group of people who woke up one day and decided they're going to kill all their cattle, they're going to burn all their fields, and they're going to commit national suicide. And the reason they did this is because they believed in some millennial, some deranged prophet led them to believe this. And this prophet happened to be a little girl who couldn't have been more than 15 years old. And we've been taught this all these years, and we write about it, as Unongau said. But clearly there's something implausible about this story. And research is beginning to come out to show that the cattle killings actually were not what they've been made out to be. That in fact, the cattle killings were a political movement. that they were a rebellion against the practice of chiefs colluding with the British to take the cattle away from the people. And the people said, if we are not going to keep our cattle, then let nobody have the cattle. Let us all kill our cattle. And so this political movement, this political act, somehow has been written down the ages so that it fits into the stereotype of the African as irrational. And where is this correction of this telling of this story to be found? It is to be found, interestingly enough, in a paper written by a white historian called Tim Stapleton, a recent paper. But if you go back to 1913 and you read a poem by A.C.K. Mqhayi, who was writing from King Williamstown, you will find a poem called non-racialism, where he questions and disputes this narrative, that it is not possible that a whole people could have listened to a 13-year-old girl and kill their cattle and their fields for no reason. But because we haven't gone into the archive of our own history, we would not have known that Mqhayi had disputed this literally 100 years ago. But we've continued to reproduce the narrative. Ultimately, as we know, of course, that those who put up resistance against British colonial rule in all its forms and all its manifestations, including non-racialism, not non-racialism as a self-inflicted tragedy, but as a tragedy that was inflicted by the colonialists, actually, or as a tragedy that came out as part of a political reaction to colonialism. But as we know, ultimately, the resistors were defeated. And they were taken to Robben Island. One of the things that need to be corrected about Robben Island is the idea that Nelson Mandela, or his definition of Robben Island around Nelson Mandela. I think that has to stop. The Xhosa chiefs who were defeated in those wars in the 1800s, Xolela, Maqoma, were taken to Robben Island. They were the first people, not the first, actually before them, our Shimato and Khoisan people were taken to Robben Island to be imprisoned as political prisoners. And Xolela Makana died trying to swim from Robben Island, escaping from Robben Island. Hence the Xhosa saying, ulinde ukuza kukaMakana, okwaNxele. But basically it means you are waiting for something that will never happen. Because Xolela had promised the Xhosa people that he would come back and continue the war of liberation, but died swimming across the ocean. And of course, Maqoma, who's regarded as the greatest of the generals in the wars of resistance, was ultimately also taken to Robben Island, where he died. And so Robben Island has to be understood in the fullness of its history. And of course, it was precisely because King Williamstown was the capital of what was then known as British Kaffraria that it attracted the graduates of the newly established mission schools of Lovedale and Hilltown, probably the most famous mission schools in the history of South Africa. For illustrative purposes, almost every political leader of note in South Africa went to one of these schools. So Nelson Mandela went to Hilltown, Robert Sobukwe went to Hilltown, Chris Hani went to Lovedale, Thabo Mbeki went to Lovedale, Steve Biko went to Lovedale. So that was a place of these institutions in the imagination over time of black people, despite the fact that they were missionary institutions. In a sense, people used them as a base for rethinking modernity and challenging it. The first graduate of Lovedale College, of course, was Dio Soga. While certainly not the first African to take up the leadership or the cause of his people after the wars, Soga would emerge as probably the most consequential leader in the second half of the 19th century, followed closely, of course, by my great-grandfather. Soga denounced African cultural values as heathen, as backward, and urged his people to basically accept Christianity and Western education and leave their African ways behind them. When one of the wars broke out in the 1840s, the missionaries took Soga to Scotland with them, where he received further training and further education as a missionary. And then he came back, fell in love with a white Scots woman, came back, married to Janet Burnside, with whom they had 4 children. And they set up a home about 10 miles, 20 miles from here. The first mission run by an African in South Africa was in a place called Umgwali, in just outside Stutterheim. And that's where the most important public personality in the African community was doing his work as a missionary on behalf of the church. However, Soga was offended when one of his Christian friends wrote an article in the King Williamstown Gazette arguing that African people were indolent and incapable of development. Now, Soga was offended not because he thought Africans were equal to Europeans. He always thought Europeans were superior. But he also thought that Africans had the capability, had the potential to develop to the level of Europeans. And so when this article appeared in the King Williamstown Gazette saying that Africans were incapable of any development, Soga was really, really furious. And he wrote what is probably one of the most historic letters in the development of the new African consciousness. And it is worth quoting from this letter which he wrote to the King Williamstown Gazette in 1865. Africa was of God given to the race of Ham. I find the Negro, from the days of the Assyrian downwards, keeping his individuality and his distinctiveness. Amid the wreck of empires and the revolution of ages, I find him keeping his place among the nations and keeping his home and country. I find him opposed by nation after nation and driven from his home. I find him enslaved, exposed to the vices and the brandy of the white man. I find him in this condition for many a day in the West Indian Islands, in Northern and South America, and in the South American colonies of Spain and Portugal. I find him exposed to all these disasters, and yet multiplying and never extinct. Yea, I find him now as the prevalence of Christian and philanthropic opinions on the rights of men obtains among civilized nations, returning unmanacled to the land of his forefathers, taking back with him the civilization and Christianity of those nations. See the Negro Republic of Liberia. I find the Negro in the present struggle in America looking forward, though with still chains in his hands and chains on his feet, yet looking forward to the dawn of a better day for himself and all his sable brethren in Africa. That was in 1865. How Soga came to possess this knowledge about the African diaspora has remained unknown. But it is inconceivable, of course, that a man of his stature, who studied in the United Kingdom, it is inconceivable that he would not have known about the likes of Martin Delaney, Alexander Crummell, Edward Blyden, and so on. But I also discovered the value of the archive in a PhD written by Joanne Davis on Soga. That in fact, before he met Janet Burnside in Scotland, he was actually in love with a woman from Trinidad and moved in the circles of people from Trinidad and would have been exposed in many, many ways to them. But yet, still, there is no exhaustive study of how those processes might have happened. And I think there's a PhD waiting to happen right there. Soga's biographer, Donovan Williams, has described this moment in Soga's life, this turn from a coconut, if you like, to a radical black nationalist as the birth of black consciousness. And indeed, Soga thereafter began to write and to speak differently. There's a wonderful little book called The Journal of Theo Soga, where the language actually literally starts to change. For example, on the eve of sending his children, his 4 sons, to Scotland to go and study because he didn't want them to study what was being taught in South Africa, Soga said this to them: I want you, for your future comfort, to be very careful on this point. These were 4 children that he had. You will ever cherish the memory of your mother as that of an upright, conscientious, thrifty Christian Scotswoman. You will ever be thankful for your connection by this tie to the white race. But if you wish to gain credit for yourselves, if you do not wish to feel the taunt of man, which you sometimes may be made to feel, take your place in the world as colored, not as white men, as Kafirs, not as Englishmen. You will be more thought of for this by all good and wise people than for the other. And there you see basically what I argue is a political choice. A political choice to identify with the oppressed. And I'm always struck, of course, by the coincidence between that and Steve Biko's conception of black consciousness as including the colors. Even more important, Soga started talking and writing in local newspapers about the importance of respecting local traditions. He had made a complete turnabout. And for African people to take interest in the development and preservation of their languages. Hence, I suppose, he is credited for being at the birth of black consciousness in this formalized sense. Like Steve Biko, more than a century after him, Soga spoke out against the deferential attitude to whites that many black people displayed. And he said, and I quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes from Soga, "This morning say of the Xhosa people, whenever they see a white face, is very annoying." Close quote. What is even more important about Soga, though, is that are the many, many young men and women who followed in his path, whose biographies and life stories remain to be written, even as we speak, and whose writings on race, in particular, call out for analysis, starting with Soga's own writings. And of course, this was not just a character of, a cast of male characters. I have in mind here the founder, for example, of the ANC Women's League and a student of W.E.B. Du Bois, Charlotte Maxeke. The great poet or poetess of the 1920s, Nontsizi Mgwetho. Phyllis Ndandala, who wrote what is regarded as one of the first feminist masterpieces in South Africa by a black woman. Noni Jabavu, the daughter of Don Tengo Jabavu and author of The Oka People. By the 1930s, a group of women had emerged, some of them, like Ndandala, and the recently deceased Epanet Mbeki, the mother to Thabo Mbeki, had emerged as Marxist intellectuals, and in many, many ways, far much more radical than their Victorian husbands who had studied at Lovedale and Hilltown. In fact, Phyllis Ndandala argues that contrary to the idea that these women came to the liberation struggle on the coattails of their boyfriends and husbands, she and Epanet Mbeki in particular were already independent activists in the movement when they met their husbands. And of course, they later formed multiracial relationships with women of other races, including people like Sisi Gool in Cape Town. According to Ndandala, and I quote, women activist intellectuals carved out a distinctive role in the struggle for liberation, both as thinkers and doers. They have often been pioneers in certain fields, often taking daring action, while their male counterparts nursed doubt and skepticism. Close quote. A study of the full role of these women activist intellectuals, again, remains to be undertaken. Going back to the pioneering works of people like Cecilia Makiwane, for example, the first black nurse in South Africa. And then, of course, there's the usual cast of characters that are known to the black world, but hardly known outside of the black world. I'm talking here about the founder of the Ethiopian movement, the Ethiopian church, Pambani Mzimba and Elijah Makiwane. Talking about the founder of the first African newspaper in South Africa, John Tengo Jabavu, who started Imvo Zabantsundu here in King Williamstown. I'm currently reading old copies of Imvo Zabantsundu from back in the 1800s, and it just blows your mind. What the discourses and the debates that were taking place in this part of the world. The first black member of the Cape Parliament was, of course, Walter Khubusana. Khubusana was the first person to be elected because black people, for a long time, even though they had the franchise, they still had this mentality that it was enough that white people should represent them in Parliament. Until Khubusana said, but if we can vote, it means we all can also stand to be voted for. We can be candidates. And it came as a shock to many black people. Are you sure you want to do this? And of course, Khubusana stood and he was elected. And he became the first and the last. Because after that, Africans were removed from the voters' roll in the Cape. Khubusana, of course, was given an honorary doctorate by Macalester College in the United States. I think it's in Chicago. And he and Jabavu basically were by far the most important, one being a parliamentarian and one being this leading journalist. But guess what? And this is what I mean when I talk about the fecklessness and the disgraceful conduct of the ANC. That nobody can tell you where Jabavu's grave is. It's supposed to be in this cemetery up the road. But nobody will actually say, this is where Jabavu's. And this was, after Tiyo Soga, the most important black man in the Cape Colony. After Soga. If you ask them where Khubusana's grave is, they will not know where Khubusana's grave is. Until I found it on the outskirts of East London in a disused place. And that was the first person to be elected to parliament in this country, standing for African rights in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And then, of course, there's the greatest of them all, in my view, S.E.K. Mqhayi, the most prolific writer and literally a literary genius. His novels are really classics in African literature, and they teased out these concepts of identity. In 1910, Mqhayi wrote a novel called Don Jadu. And Don Jadu is not very different from Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward. But it is this idea of projecting, and he writes and describes this future South Africa, where men and women can enjoy, of all races, can enjoy equal rights. And it's contained in this little novel written by Mqhayi. So this process of imagination is happening through novels and through fiction in the works of somebody like Mqhayi. But because Mqhayi refused to write in English, even though he was a graduate of Lovedale, he's not regarded as a Nobel laureate type of figure. And he was, by any stretch of the imagination, probably the best that this country has ever produced. Only that he wrote in isiXhosa. And I've been doing some work around Mqhayi at the Colonial Library in Grahamstown. He wrote impeccable English. But he made a political decision that he would never write a word in English. And so he was editor of Imvoza Bansundu, which is Jabavu's newspaper, all in Xhosa. And what Mqhayi was saying was that this thing we call syncretism, this idea of syncretism, is often the question of how black people can master the white world, how we can show how much we know Shakespeare, and then we can qualify to be syncretic. But what about the other journey the other side, where white people begin to learn our languages, the culture, and all of that? That is the day you can really say you've actually made a big move against racism. When we all begin to speak the same languages and we're part of each other's cultures. And Mqhayi was challenging racism even back then through his work of fiction. In his book, A Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela recalls the impact that Mqhayi had on him in particular. Mqhayi visited Hilltown, where Mandela was at high school. He was invited. The day he was invited was declared a holiday because of the stature of the person who was coming. By this time, Mqhayi had been declared Imbongi Yesizwe, the poet of the nation, our poet laureate, within the black community, of course. Could be and by the way, Mqhayi wrote the national anthem. I mean, Enoch Sondonga did the first couple of lines and the music, but the bulk of the South African, the Nkosi Sikelel' Africa, was written by S.E.K. Mqhayi. And how many people don't know that? Very few, and our children don't know that. But for Mqhayi, Nkosi Sikelel' Africa was again this expression of an African consciousness. Mandela writes about the day that Mqhayi arrived at Hilltown College. He describes it as follows. On that day, there was a stage. They were in a hall. There was a stage at one end of the hall. And on that stage was a door that led to Dr. Wellington's house. Dr. Wellington was the headmaster. The door itself was nothing special, says Mandela, for no one ever walked through it, except, of course, Dr. Wellington. Suddenly, the door opened and out walked not Dr. Wellington, but a black man dressed in a leopard skin kaross and matching hat, who was carrying a spear in either hand. And Mandela says, I could hardly believe my ears at what he was to say. His boldness in speaking of such delicate matters as racism in the presence of Dr. Wellington himself and other whites, it seemed utterly astonishing to us. Yet at the same time, it aroused and motivated us and began to alter my own perception of men like Dr. Wellington, whom I had always automatically considered my benefactor. Close quote. Mqai's influence, of course, is legendary on people like Gavin Beggy and a whole generation of people. Why is this history important when it comes to Nelson Mandela? I'm writing a book about Mandela, so this is part of my experimentation. I am just tired of every biography you read about Mandela. It's about how he learned to be a leader by listening to the elders at the court of his uncle, who was a chief. That's what you will hear all the time. And there is none of this history. Because you see, this history suddenly makes Mandela a product of a political movement. It suddenly makes Mandela a child of modernity. It doesn't fit the script that the people who write about Mandela want to project. And so you have this image of this boy who came from the rural areas and was catapulted into the urban areas and into modernity. There's none of what was Mandela reading in the newspapers. Because the newspapers were written in isiXhosa, so even when he was young, he was reading Imvo Zabantsundu. He must have been reading the debates. What were the debates at places like Clarkbury and Hilltown College? Surely there were political conversations taking place there about democracy and the rights of African people. It cannot be. And then he went to Fort Hare. So it is implausible to argue that Mandela learned this thing of leadership by simply listening to the elders as they were talking in this rural traditional household. And that explains the great man that he is. It fits into what I call the anthropologization of black people. The idea that they cannot be agents outside of this narrative of a movement from the rural, the traditional, into modernity. And when you look at the actual reality of black life in South Africa, it's impossible to speak of a separation between the rural and the urban. But that conceptual distinction is a conceptual distinction that is imposed from Europe in many ways, from the growth of cities in Europe, and is imposed on analysis of what is happening in South Africa. It's impossible to speak of the rural-urban divide in South Africa, particularly at that time, because the rural was always in the urban. Black people had to be in this place temporarily. They had to get a permit to work in King Williamstown. When they are done, they belonged actually in the village. They were not allowed to be urban, settled, permanent people in the rural villages. And did you put Chris? Exactly, one of the older people here in Ginsberg. But the point I'm making is this, that the rural was always there in the urban, and the urban was always there in the rural. But Mandela himself is responsible for this narrative. For reasons I go into it in my own book, but they have to do with his own self-conception as a child of modernity. Between this list of individuals that I've given you is I'm just giving you the probably many more. Not there are probably, there are many more individuals whose lives, whose contributions, whose writings need to be studied. For example, I didn't mention William Gqoba, who wrote the first essay on education. It was just called Education in the 1840s in a newspaper called Indaba. But do you think that there is one program in this country, one university program in this country that does this research? I don't know if you guys do it at Wits. So the whole cultural history of this place remains unwritten, let alone talked about. The generation of people, the group of people I've listed, of course, are people who dominated the political landscape between the 1840s, 50s, until the 1930s, I would argue. And they came, of course, out of a particular conception of modernity, of a liberal modernity, except, of course, for people like Mngcayi. But things started to change in the 1940s with the emergence, first of all, with what was happening in the Soviet Union and the emergence of Marxism as a radicalizing influence on young people. You should also remember now that for the first time, black people have got a university called Fort Hare. And people like Govan Begi are beginning to study Marxism. And the liberal Victorian attitude, the assimilationism towards race in particular, is then rejected by both the Marxists and the Africanists, who were led by Anton Lembede and later by Robert Sobukwe. And those are the people who begin to critique the ANC and the Victorian notion of a liberal multiracialism. Because the multiracialism fit within this narrative structure that Soga had articulated, that the Africans would one day kind of reach the apex and be equal with the whites. And so the younger people at the time, challenged the old guard. And this deference, this liberal multiracialism is actually best articulated in a statement by Chief Albert Luthuli, who was the president of the ANC. And this is what Luthuli says. And Luthuli's, in his own words, his vision was that of what he called a multiracial society in a non-racial democracy. But it was this idea that we can live together in a non-racial democracy, non-racial in the normative sense of the term, and multiracial in the descriptive sense of the term. We don't have to be equal, necessarily. But we can accept each other and we can live, we can coexist. And this, by the way, was part of what was happening in other parts on the continent. As liberation movements were beginning to assert their independence, colonial governments came up with notions of partnership, or what later was called consociational democracy. But all kinds of ways of power sharing. And this multiracialism kind of fit that political need of the colonial governments. And so people like Luthuli were addressing themselves like their brethren, if you like, in other African countries, to South African whites, saying, why can't we also have these partnerships as a multiracial society in a non-racial democracy? Speaking at the treason trial in 1956, Luthuli articulated the problematic nature of this position, addressing himself to the magistrates. This is what he said: Africans cannot manage without the whites in South Africa. Now, this is the president of the ANC. Africans cannot manage without the whites in South Africa. We have accepted your civilization, and we like it. And we are absorbing it as far as we can. Despite the efforts of your government to cut us off from it. So this was the dominant, if you like, narrative until, as I said earlier on, people like Robert Sobukwe came up, and the unity movement came up with this concept of non-racialism. There are these things of belittling multiracialism by saying it's racialism multiplied. And Sobukwe comes up with this wonderful definition of non-racialism, arguing that there are no races, there is only one human race. This concept of non-racialism is a concept, of course, that gets hijacked by the ANC in the 1980s. But it is a concept that originates with the PAC and the unity movement. actually, it is a concept that originates with Jan Smuts, actually, and the Afrikaners, about their relationship with the English. And race, in that sense, was being used in the Hegelian sense of nation. So it was non-racial in the sense of Afrikaner-English relationships. But within the context of the liberation movement, black people have always done what Skip Gates called signifying, right? Always sort of appropriating and reappropriating these concepts. I mean, the biggest example, I think, of this signification is the Black consciousness movement. I'll come to that a little later. But there was a problem with the PAC's conception of non-racialism. And that problem was of both a strategic and a sociological nature. The PAC was very unhappy with the fact that white people dominated the ANC. And that is why it broke away from the ANC. And then it adopted a go-it-alone strategy, that black people have to mobilize themselves. But then it also had this definition of non-racialism, in which it was saying there's no race. We are all members of the human race. And if you show your allegiance and your loyalty to Africa, then we regard you as an African, and you belong here. And then, of course, Patrick Duncan showed up at the door, a white guy, a white son of a former governor, and said, you're talking about a white man like me who's redefined himself as an African. So the PAC accepted Patrick Duncan. And of course, the PAC accepted other white people who were radical Africanists, like Costa Goza, and we know a lot of them. The problem, of course, was sociological, because the PAC, on the one hand, wanted to make intellectual sense. It wanted intellectual clarity to itself, first of all, conceptually. So it defined non-racialism as this ideology, as it responded to the ANC's multiracialism. And so it had to be consistent with that and had to accept these white members. But the PAC was also saying to its rank and file, we are an Africanist organization, no whites. So it was speaking out of two sides of its mouth, basically. A very sophisticated intellectual non-racialism by Robert Sobukwe, who was a Wits University lecturer on the one hand, and a very radical Africanism among its rank and file. Because the PAC is, as an organization, had this bifurcated identity of basically a frustrated black middle class in the townships and a frustrated working and poor class in the same communities. That is why Ginsberg became a stronghold of the PAC, not the ANC. Because this township is a classic illustration of the coexistence of a very angry black professional middle class with a very poor working class community that was living in this area here called Xolela. And it is this contradiction in its own dynamics, I argue, that in fact has led in many ways to the demise of the PAC. The Black consciousness movement did not have this contradiction, because Biko was basically talking to members of the same class. They were all students at the University of Natal. And when they went to other, so there was no possibility of misunderstanding, or of lying or misrepresenting, of talking out of two mouths. Because the Black consciousness movement started out essentially as a middle class movement. And even when it moved into the poor communities, it did not move using these terms or these concepts. It moved using the concept of development. And so its entry into the communities was that of black community development, the black community programs. The black community programs, I argue, enabled Biko to, in many, many ways, and of course, he was able to escape that contradiction by the very fact that he rejected non-racialism from the start as a strategy, not as an end goal. So the movement, in a way, is an improvisation, if you like, on the PAC. It is very much influenced by the PAC. Steve Biko's older brother was the leader of the PAC here in Ginsberg. According to legend, there were only two members of the PAC, of the ANC in Ginsberg in the 60s. And that was Griffiths Mxenge and Steve Tshwete. But everybody else was PAC. And it's easy to understand why Biko would have been influenced by PAC. But there's a dramatic departure in many ways from what the PAC was doing. And to Biko, we begin to talk about anti-racism. But this happens a little later. But what Biko does is to pierce through the artificiality. You said it was an opiate of the masses yesterday, Ashir. To pierce through that and to show how non-racialism and multiracialism had become the opiate of the masses. And was beginning to ask questions about how do we think about race in more honest ways. I mean, sometimes we are tempted to talk very philosophically and in a very sophisticated way about black consciousness. But essentially it was about how do we talk honestly to each other about race, and how do we respect each other and each other's what made black consciousness in many, many ways so effective, I would argue, is that it was speaking in this everyday language. It was able to translate the very abstract and complex philosophical concepts into everyday life. And of course, by the 1980s, Biko had died, and I was part of, Andile was, part of the generation when he was killed that said, okay, we're not going to allow his death to kill the movement. And so we formed, I recruited you, right? we formed the Azanian People's Organization, and you, Linda, I recruited you. We formed the Azanian People's Organization, right? A branch here, and the Azanian Students' Movements. And we were all there together. And the idea was that we were not going to let the movement die. But the truth of the matter, and I know you guys won't accept what I'm about to say, is that the horse had already bolted. It's very hard to say, but black consciousness as a political movement had can I say this? It was over. That's so sad. I can't believe I said that. But that's because I'm an academic, guys. Because I'm not a scholar. I'm not an activist anymore, so I can say these things. But the interesting paradox of that for me is that the relevance of black consciousness today, it seems to me, goes back to what was Biko's initial idea, actually. So the death of the movement, politically, in a paradoxical way, takes it back to what Biko wanted it to be in the first place. Because Biko didn't want the movement to be a political movement. And he was very explicit about that. He wanted the movement to be what he called a cultural movement. Because by presenting itself as a cultural movement, it would escape, if you like, or protect itself from attack by the state. It's pretty much the same way if you want to think about the Velvet Revolution in Europe. But it was the idea that, we'll organize, we'll have all these arts projects, we'll have all these community development projects, and those things ultimately will lead to the political movement. But he was overruled, and the young Turks or radicals in the movement said, you know what? Sorry, man. We want a political movement. And then they in turn made him their honorary president. And he accepted that. And he was the main defense witness when those guys, and he had warned them. He had warned them. But when they were arrested in the Sasso Frelimo rallies, they called him to come and testify in their defense and basically to put his life on the line. And he did. And if you want the very best statement on black consciousness, you have to read that trial and its proceedings. There's a book by Millard Arnold. It's just called The Testimony of Steve Biko. And really it's his articulation of this concept of black consciousness. And so it seems to me that the relevance of black consciousness today is not so much as a political party, but as a transcendent movement that speaks to this issue of values. I've been a newspaper columnist now in this country for the past 15 to 20 years, and I've been sounding like a broken record, that we cannot even begin to get anywhere until we speak to the issue of what are the values. And you cannot speak to the values if you don't speak or go into the cultural history. Unfortunately, the ANC and the government have chosen basically a line which is quite consistent with their modernist origins. But basically that is the economy. If you can get the economy right, and if you can get the people fed, then your problems will be solved. And of course, we know how untrue that is. And so in South Africa, we are in a situation that I describe. I was on a television debate with Paulo Jordan, one of the leaders of the ANC, and he accused me of speaking in hyperbole, in hyperbolic language. And of course, I do. I confess to that. And so we are in a perilous moment in South Africa. The situation that black people in particular find themselves in is no different than the situation that Biko found in the 1960s, if not worse. The university where I teach, and the number of universities now in South Africa are doing away with race-based affirmative action. And I've been a participant in these debates in defense of race-based affirmative action. And I won't take you through those debates, and I'm sure you're familiar with those debates. But at the heart of this movement is the idea that talking about race is tantamount to reproducing apartheid identities. That talking about race goes against the non-racial project. And it is so annoying when you see white guys that you know are avowed racists, telling you that, hey man, listen, we're non-racialists, we're not supposed to talk about race. And I always say to the ANC guys, we told you, you should have followed the anti-racist discourse that we were suggesting. In the 1980s, we had this big debate about non-racialism or anti-racism. And we were saying, we don't want this non-racialism stuff, let us go with anti-racism. But we lost that battle. And these are some of the contradictions and the ironies of what is happening. The worst part, I think, is how fearful black people are in South Africa of white people. Especially the black middle class in the institutions where we operate. I mean, I wrote an article in the Sunday Times the other day about the University of Cape Town and the statistics of racial inequality. And I got two kinds of responses. One was, are you sure really you want to do this? And it's all over the country. And that's what I mean when I say that we are in a moment that is not different from what Biko was talking about in the 1960s. Black people speak in the very same hushed tones in the cover of darkness, or as Steve would have put it, on the bus on the way from work, or in our case now, in their air-conditioned cars on the way to the next cocktail party. That is the condition we are in. Last night I got a couple of messages about this article. And this is a very typical response. One said, "Hey man, how are you? Thanks for an excellent article in the Sunday Times. It is high time we join you in this debate." This is now 2013. And then another one says, "We are well colonized, as Biko would say. Our leaders worship whites." Another one comes in, "Hi man, a very good article, my friend. Let us deepen this conversation. It will be a betrayal of Biko if we let whites have the last word on our fate." And all of these come in the cover of darkness and in the privacy of SMSs. So if you want to ask me what the real betrayal of Biko is, it is these messages, well-meaning as they may be. And so this is the need for black consciousness, not in the political sense in which Biko articulated it, but in what, in my own creativity, I've started to call a consciousness of blackness. That this country needs to be conscious of the black experience. And that has to start with black people themselves, to take that history seriously. And I don't know, and the ANC has shown it has no interest in doing this. So it is in institutions like this, it is in media, it is in universities, that this has to start. Now, I don't know when my friend says it's about high time that they join me in this debate, whether that's going to amount to anything. But black consciousness has a relevance to the extent that we can retrieve from it those powerful analytical concepts that have enabled black people, as racism mutates, Achille, as you were saying yesterday. Over the past 200 years, racism has mutated so many times that at each time, black people have come up with new ways of dealing with it. So there should be nothing exceptional about our age, you would imagine, except that is the very definition of our age. That there is absolutely no reawakening of thought in this country. It's a very gloomy picture to tell, but I prefer to tell it that way. Thabo Mbeki came up with an idea of an African Renaissance before he became its worst enemy, and now we're stuck with Jacob Zuma, who won't even go anywhere near that. And all he can do is muster some derogatory things about this country being not Malawi. And that is a reflection of where we have come as a country. But to the extent that black consciousness can help us deal with racism, to the extent that it can provide us with the tools for conceptual analysis and critique of our present, it remains relevant. Because racism will always show itself through so many manifestations and articulations. But it will always show itself. As Eric Hobsbawm puts it, we are wrong to put a particular face and costume to the stranger whose arrival we were told to expect. It will reappear. And what it needs is for us to have a certain sense of preparedness and readiness. And our history is rich with examples of how to do that. Thank you very much.